Hi everybody, welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 11th of June, where I wanted to continue our conversations about persuasion. As you will remember, last class we talked a little bit about writing conventions for upcoming papers. And my hope is that you're beginning to think about paper number one, which could be devoted to the story of an hour, though writing about a short story is a very different kind of exercise than writing about a novel, our first novel being Frankenstein. Or you could also write about persuasion, which is where we are now. My suspicion is that Jane Eyre would probably be a better choice for paper number two, just in terms of where the due dates fall, since paper number one is going to be approximately midway through our semester, while paper number two is going to be towards the ending of the semester. And everybody has the option of rewriting paper number one for a higher grade, so I see it as a kind of learning exercise. And with persuasion, we have a novel with a central female character, something that we didn't see with Frankenstein. And we speculated a little bit about why that might be, that we had a female author that gave us a very male-centric world. And in many ways, it seems that what we are given is a male-centric world that has excluded female, and we see the negative consequences as a result of that. Unless, of course, you want to see the central female character in Frankenstein as nature or Mother Nature. And, of course, once Mother Nature is rejected, then we see the negative consequences of that as well. In Persuasion, we get Anne Elliot. And she basically is the narrator, and we see the world through her eyes. And her world is based on her family relationships. She is part of the Elliot family, which serves as a kind of microcosm of the world. This family has a certain level of status and privilege in Britain, and we get to see through very gentle satire some of the critiques that our author has about that particular lifestyle. It also is a romance as well. It's very much a world of manners and decorum where marriage is not necessarily about romantic union, but it's more about making a good match, about furthering oneself socially, or politically, or economically, or at the very least maintaining the same status, making a good match again. And persuasion, to gently influence, is basically what we see the author doing in the text, to try to gently influence us to see some of the negatives of this vacuous kind of lifestyle. We see the importance also in this book of balance and compromise. There's lots of references to falling, either characters falling literally or falling in love. And the idea is that you need to have balance. When you fall, you've lost control. So there are lots of different ways to pursue this text. I had suggested, just because of the sheer number of characters, that you might want to keep a chart, which is what I've done in the notes below. And oftentimes the characters have similar names, which makes it easier to confuse them. And I've divided up the characters by gender, male and female, though there are many ways that you could divide up these characters, for instance, by marital status. But in terms of the central male characters, that would begin with Sir Walter Elliot, who is the patriarch of the Elliot family, and he is a widower. What that means is that the central question is, will he remarry? This becomes an important question because he has no male children that are alive, at least. He has only 3 daughters. So there are questions about what will happen with inheritance. Because that's usually passed down to the closest male relative in the family. So if he remarries, there's the possibility that he could have children, and there's the possibility that he could have a male heir, which would completely change the dynamic of the inheritance. Now, Charles Musgrove happens to be Sir Walter Elliot's son-in-law. He's married to Sir Walter Elliot's younger daughter, Mary. Basically, he married her. Get it? Married her. And the intrigue here is that he once courted and even proposed to Anne, who is the middle daughter. And That said, we know that there's going to be some tension between the sisters, knowing that his first preference was Anne, and then he ended up, for lack of a better word, settling for Mary. We're also introduced to Frederick Wentworth. Now, this was somebody who did court Anne at one point, but he didn't have the status and the money in order for the family to support that relationship. So they basically are or were not able to marry, and he joined the military. In other words, he went to achieve his worth. And notice that Frederick's last name is Wentworth. He went to get his worth. And he is reintroduced into the novel now that he has fulfilled his service, and he is both embracing the status and the income that he didn't have in previous years. And of course, the major question, because he's single, is who will he marry? Especially in this small world, transportation options were limited, and certainly they didn't have the options that we have today. And also, if one was to marry within one station, and the assumption was at this level of society one would marry within one station or higher, there were really a limited number of options. It's one of the reasons why cousins so frequently marry, is so that they can maintain family name and family inheritance. So when Frederick Wentworth comes and is introduced into the Elliot family circle, there's a lot of buzz because all of the single women are interested in him. There is a William Elliot. Notice that he has the same name as Sir Walter Elliot. He's a cousin in the Elliot family, and he is the male heir presumptive at this point. Eventually, he starts courting Anne. Now, of course, his concern would be that if Sir Walter Elliot were to marry and to have a son, then he wouldn't necessarily be the male presumptive. Unless, of course, he were to marry Anne, and they would find a way to ultimately be able to gain access to the fortune. Though William Elliot at this point has amassed a nice amount of money, he's not that worried about income because he is a widower and he had married initially, as we learn, and I hope this isn't a spoiler, for money. What he's more interested in is status. That he doesn't have, and being able to marry Anne would mean that he would have the status of being in the Sir Elliot family, a direct heir in the Sir Elliot family. We have a Mr. Musgrove, who is Charles Musgrove's father. Remember again, Charles Musgrove is married to Sir Walter's youngest daughter, Mary. And Mr. Musgrove and Mrs. Musgrove, notice that they basically do not have the title of Sir. So there's a different level in hierarchy. They're lower in status. We are also introduced to individuals who have achieved status and income, not through birthright, but through their effort and their profession, specifically the military. And that's where we're introduced to people such as Admiral Croft. Admiral Croft ends up renting Kellynch Hall from the Elliot family, from Sir Walter. And this is one of the major cruxes at the beginning of the novel, is that the Elliot family still has status because of their station, but they don't have the financial resources that they once had in the past. In other words, they're in debt, and they need to find a way to be able to pay off their debts. And the idea comes about that they will rent the family hall, and of course they want to do so in a way that results in their not losing any kind of status or experiencing any kind of embarrassment. So a story is created that the family will be traveling, and as a kind of favor, they decided to rent their homestead to a worthy individual, somebody who is honorable enough and worthy enough to be in Kellynch Hall, but not somebody of higher status than the Elliots, because that would overshadow them. And that's what they get with an Admiral Croft, who is also married, and Admiral and Mrs. Croft do not have any children. And this, in and of itself, is rather surprising for that time period, perhaps even for our time period. The idea that their marriage is not about producing children. It's about the fulfillment they receive with each other. Their marriage is not one for status or for money. It's about a marriage of connection. And that's something that Anne, who is going to be our central narrator, is quite observant about. And in fact, Anne acts as an observer throughout the entire piece. Because we're introduced to Admiral Croft, we're introduced to Admiral Croft's friends, and that includes captains, such as Captain Harville, who happens to be a friend of not only the Admiral, but Frederick Wentworth. And Frederick Wentworth, remember, he went and he found his worth. Captain Harville is married, and Captain Harville has a friend, and that's Captain Benwick. And that happens to be Captain Harville's friend, so friends of a friend. And Captain Benwick basically had a fiancée who died before they could marry. So the question is, again, will he court again? You see that this is a major question, the idea of the marriages and the unions that will be occurring. And then we get Charles Hayter, who happens to be the Musgrove family cousin. He's single, and he's courting one of the Musgrove daughters, Henrietta. Again, not unusual for cousins to court or marry to maintain birthright or to maintain inheritance. The major female characters. And of course, we have a female author who's giving us a major female character through Anne Elliot. We see through her eyes. But the three Elliot daughters, the eldest is Elizabeth Elliot. She's single. She's not courting anybody. Even though she's older than Anne, there's less concern about the fact of her marrying. The assumption is that she will marry one day, and Sir Walter is very much enjoying having his eldest daughter sort of take the place of caretaker for his deceased wife. Anne Elliot, the middle child, and I guess, in family dynamics, it oftentimes is said that middle children are perhaps given less attention than younger children and older children, and I think Anne Elliot exhibits that. She's the middle daughter, and she's single, and she's getting older, and even though her sister Elizabeth is older, the concern with Anne is that she is, quote, lost her bloom, unquote, that she no longer has her youthful beauty. The question is, who would ever want to court her? She had her opportunity when she was younger with Wentworth, but of course he didn't have the status and he didn't have the income. So Anne was persuaded, knows the title, by a well-intentioned family friend not to pursue that relationship. So the third daughter, the youngest daughter, I've mentioned earlier, and that happens to be Mary Musgrove, and she's Sir Walter's youngest, and she's married. And she very much is illustrative of the kind of woman that we talked about in The Cult of True Womanhood, that she seems to be rather soft and pliable. She oftentimes suffers from the vapors. She needs a good amount of attention. She seems to be very self-centered and very shallow. The exact opposite of Anne, in effect. Certainly, Mary does not come off in a very positive way, but she's not cruel. Elizabeth, the oldest daughter, is cold and cruel and distant to Anne. So in some ways, perhaps Elizabeth is worse than Mary is. Lady Russell. And notice that she has the title of lady, again, the idea of British hierarchy. And she is family friend and serves as a mother figure to Anne. Anne is basically motherless because her father is a widow. And I had referenced earlier that we oftentimes will see in the text this semester, not that I had intended it this way, the idea of motherless characters. And that said, Lady Russell was the one, with good intentions, who had tried to persuade Anne not to be with Frederick Wentworth. And we are going to see, as we go through the course of the novel, how correct or incorrect Lady Russell was in that advice. And we have Lady Russell being a widow and not courting, and it's not even speculated that she would court. And that, I think, says a great deal about the idea of marriage and its function during the time period. Less about romance and more about economic security, and also for social advancement or for securing social position. And Lady Russell has no children, and the assumption is that Lady Russell is the heir of the estate of her late husband, which means that she wouldn't have an economic need to remarry. And one of the reasons perhaps why it's not considered unusual or suspicious or noteworthy that she's not courting. There isn't the kind of speculation, will she court, the way there is with Sir Walter Elliot. And certainly Sir Walter Elliot has a certain level of status and a certain level of money. But the idea of him remarrying would be to have a kind of caretaker, which is what his eldest daughter is doing now, which gets us right back to the cult of true womanhood and the role of wife and mother. So I had indicated that there was a much higher rate of males remarrying during this time period than females, and I think economic and social reasons are some of the reasons why females didn't necessarily feel the need. Think about Mrs. Mallard in The Story of an Hour, and notice that there wasn't reference to children, where she feels a sense of freedom because now as a widow she's got status, and one assumes that she would have a certain level of economic security as well, even though we get just a little snippet into her life, literally an hour, but enough to be able to speculate about those things and have those speculations seem rather reasonable. So we have a Mrs. Musgrove. This is Charles Musgrove's mother. Of course, Mrs. Musgrove is married to Mr. Musgrove. Anne is going to be spending a lot of time with the Musgroves. So this is the family that has married into the Elliots, or perhaps the Elliots is married into the Musgroves. This is where Anne is able to expand her world beyond her immediate blood family. This is where she begins to come into her own, gain a certain level of self-esteem, a certain level of respect that she doesn't earn from her own family members, and is even able to regain some of her, quote, youthful bloom. Now, the Musgroves have unmarried daughters, and of course, that's going to lead to the question of who will they marry. We have a Louisa Musgrove, and she is the sister to Charles Musgrove. She's single, and she's courted, as the novel progresses, by Frederick Wentworth. Remember him? Who used to court Anne. And Wentworth is very impressed with her strong will, something that Anne was unable to exhibit when they had courted so many years ago, because Anne was so easily persuaded to abandon the relationship because he didn't have status and money. There also is a Henrietta Musgrove, another daughter of the Musgroves, another sister to Charles Musgrove, who is single. She's being courted by a family cousin. Again, not unusual at the time period for cousins to marry, again, to retain things like birthright. And the cousin is Charles Hayter. We are also introduced to a Mrs. Clay. This is a very interesting character. Notice that she does not have a title the way Lady Russell does. She's just a Mrs. She is a widow, but she is a poor widow, so she doesn't have status. She happens to be the friend of Elizabeth. And of course, the scuttlebutt, because she's spending so much time with Elizabeth, is that does she have machinations to try to be able to seduce Sir Walter Elliot so that she could remarry and gain the income and the status of the family. I don't think Mrs. Clay understands some of the financial deprivations that the family is experiencing. They're trying to keep it on the hush-hush. Her father is a Mr. Shepherd. He also is, and she is also, I should say, Mrs. Clay, a widow. And Mr. Shepherd serves to kind of shepherd the family, if you want to think about it that way, to help them with their financial difficulties. And it's the explanation of how Elizabeth first met Mrs. Clay. It was through the family lawyer. And will Sir Walter court Mrs. Clay? And, if you think about clay, you can mold clay. Clay is very malleable. That's a hint, some foreshadowing about what might occur later on in the novel. I don't want to give away too many spoilers if you're still going through the novel proper itself. Later on in the novel, since there are 2 sections to the novel, we're introduced to a Mrs. Smith. Think about the last name Smith. It's very commonplace and ordinary. And it's chosen very deliberately. Again, this is not somebody of status or hierarchy. Another widow. Notice how many widows there are in this text. And this is Anne's friend. And Mrs. Smith is not courting. She is in ill health and she is in bad financial straits. Goes to show what happens to female if they aren't in a position of privilege when they become widow. They could be very vulnerable. Yet Anne maintains that friendship, which is supposed to show a certain level of character from Anne, that she cares less about status and money, and she cares more about integrity and personality. And then we've got a Mrs. Croft, who's married to the Admiral Croft, who it turns out the Crofts are related to Frederick Wentworth. So it turns out that Mrs. Croft is Frederick Wentworth's sister. So this explains why Wentworth is introduced into the circle of characters when he returns back from the military. He has to go to Kellynch Hall to visit, well, his sister. And when he's there, he sees ultimately some former acquaintances, including his former flame, Anne. So, minor characters that come up. 2 that I wanted to draw your attention to, the Viscountess Dalrymple. So, if you think about it, Sir Walter Elliot has a certain level of status, but in the world of status and hierarchy, he's not nearly as high as a count or a viscountess. So we will see how Sir Walter Elliot acts to those beneath him in status, but also how Sir Walter Elliot acts to those above him in status through the character of the Viscountess Dalrymple. And, of course, as I had indicated earlier, Mr. Shepherd is the family attorney who's going to be shepherding them. So I hope that this review of characters helped you a little bit in sort of sorting things out. And I suspect that this is the point of the semester where you might be having some trouble keeping up with the reading. So what I'm going to do is just to stop here and allow you to finish the novel if you haven't already done so. And then we can talk about the novel more in depth next class and introduce the idea of Jane Eyre. And as I had said, Jane Eyre is our longest novel of the semester, and I'll be including a link below for those of you who want to start Jane Eyre now. But it moves much more quickly than Persuasion does. So I think that you will find it a much easier read. But again, Persuasion is supposed to be a long and laborious read to show what the lifestyle is of those individuals who have privilege and class within society, that they are filling their empty moments with dinner parties and with gossip, and they really aren't producing much of anything of value, either in their relationships or in society as a whole. It's something that Anne is able to see very clearly. So I'll talk about some important quotes next class. And for our discussion forum question, as I had indicated, I wanted to bring us back to the idea of paper number 1. So this question will be due Thursday the 13th, where I'm asking, at this point, do you have an idea what you'll write paper number 1 about? And if so, what is that idea? It's perfectly fine to say no. But if you have an idea, feel free to discuss it. As you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, though you're certainly encouraged to, much like you would be in a face-to-face class if you were to decide to raise your hand and to participate. But you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. And that counts as your attendance, so to speak. So again, our attendance question is, at least at this point, what do you think you'll write paper number 1 about? Again, you're not required to have an idea. You could say that you're not quite sure at this point, but I want to try to encourage you to start thinking about that. Where next class, we'll talk about some of the major themes and important quotes in Persuasion and introduce the idea of Jane Eyre. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye bye.